Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Elwick, a lecturer at Middlesex University and also UCL Institute of Education. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to talk today about teaching controversial and sensitive issues in the wake of 9/11. So one of the things that I find kind of difficult to get my head around sometimes is the fact that none of the students, none of the pupils in school today, and for a while now, were actually alive at the time of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which maybe if you're teaching in schools is something quite obvious and sort of you kind of recognize that every day, but it's something as a researcher that I think is really important to keep kind of reminding ourselves of. But obviously students, pupils are profoundly affected by the repercussions of that event, and particularly around two kind of policy statutory instruments, so the prevent duty and the fundamental British values. So today I'm going to talk based on some research for both the Association for Citizenship Teaching and some slightly more recent research done for the charity since 9/11, as well as referencing some of the wider literature base around this and around these issues. So to provide a bit of background first, and this might be very familiar to some, but I'll just sort of set the scene and give a bit of the context. So following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, around about a year, 18 months later, the Home Office in this country developed in 2003 contest, the National Counterterrorism Strategy, which has gone through several iterations since then. Back in 2003, it wasn't public. It was made public in 2006 in the UK. And it's built around four strands, the so-called four Ps of prevent, pursue, protect, and prepare, with prevent almost certainly the most controversial, probably the best known. Prevent became a statutory duty in 2015, and essentially a range of public bodies, but for our purposes, obviously schools and teachers are charged with the duty to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. And this kind of phase of prevent is all around the idea of identifying and trying to stop, to prevent, obviously, radicalization. And while the engagement of individuals in terrorism is clearly a reality, we're all sort of aware of the major kind of high-profile incidents around terrorism, there's no definable set of indicators or social or economic circumstances. There's no identifiable conveyor belt process that can predict who will move towards terrorism, when and why. So that makes the concept of radicalization really problematic. Despite the fact that Prevent is ostensibly set up to develop systems of identifying and intervening with individuals at risk of radicalizing. And then you've got that as a statutory duty, it's a legal requirement on schools and teachers. And then on the other side, we've got the fundamental British values, which are which have been part of the guidelines, the guidance for schools in terms of SMSC education, which is spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development. So this is something that is inspected under the Ofsted framework. It's something that schools are expected to have a duty to actively promote these fundamental British values, which are democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance for those with different faiths and beliefs. And actually, these two things, although they're sort of slightly separate, are kind of bound up within each other, because extremism is defined as opposition to the fundamental British values. So if the prevent policy is all about preventing people from being drawn into terrorism and extremism, then the FBVs are the way that the government defines what extremism is. So I've been kind of working on this for around 5 years, and against this kind of legislative backdrop, if we're thinking about how teachers can address controversial or sensitive issues, I'm going to draw on three particular projects that all are related and sort of interlinked. So the first of these, I did with Lee Jerome from Middlesex University, and was with the Association for Citizenship Teaching. So it was a project called Building Resilience, where around 10 schools set up citizenship lessons, and we kind of evaluated their schemes of work, observed some of the lessons, interviewed teachers, focus groups, and surveys with the students. Then more recently, a project with Middlesex and UCL, we've evaluated the Educate Against Hate websites. That's a DFE, Department for Education website, that essentially acts as a kind of resource hub for resources around teaching around extremism, radicalization, And then the third of those projects has just finished just a few months ago, finished it in time for the anniversary of 9/11, the 20th anniversary. And it was addressing extremism through classroom practice. So a project that was funded by this charity since 9/11 and was carried out with colleagues from the Centre for Teachers and Teaching Research at UCL IOE. And that was a survey of about 100, just over 100 teachers, and some focus groups, some interviews with teachers and students in a smaller number of schools, a bit more in depth. So to sort of start with, if we start with the student angle, and then I'll come on to talk about the sort of teaching side. Students in our research have kind of routinely told us that they have relatively few opportunities to discuss terrorism, extremism, or the media portrayal of these issues, either in school or at home. So this quote from one of our students that we spoke to, was in a focus group from our work with Lee back in 2016. And those we spoke to often argued that they didn't want opportunities just to learn about the facts. They also needed to be guided by teachers that they trust to develop a deeper understanding of what's happening and how to make sense of it. And we sort of got a sense that the students themselves felt that the better knowledge and understanding might help them build some form of resilience, especially against fear and confusion that often accompanies high-profile terrorist attacks. So there's perhaps this sense that for some students at least, there are few opportunities to discuss the issues, but that they really value those opportunities when they come up and would value more. So again, a quote from a student, here they tell you the facts and the truth, here being their particular school, not protecting us, they let us know what these people actually do. And again, in their research, so Quartermain, a different piece of literature, found that there's genuine interest from pupils in discussing the relationship between terrorism and religion. And what's kind of really important, I think, is the high level of trust that students express in their teachers. So we found this in our research, but also in Paul Thomas and colleagues' research in 2017. They found that young people are more likely to discuss concerns over radicalisation with their teachers than with other bodies, for instance, the police. And it's precisely because of that level of trust that the teachers have such responsibility in their classroom, but also freedom and opportunity. So as one specialist citizenship teacher said in my work with Lee, you're in a better place of trust in the students' eyes, and will often take what you say as gospel. So within the prevent policy, we know there are these connections between prevent and the fundamental British values in terms of one of the ways that schools can promote resilience, this sort of duty or this expectation that schools will promote the FBVs. But what we've sort of found, and what the literature sort of says, is that actually, so this study from Yanmat 2018 was that there was already really high levels of support amongst students, amongst secondary school students for the values that are listed as FBVs. So this research, although it was published in 2018, was actually from before the guidance around FBVs was published. But those values around democracy, around tolerance and respect were already kind of universally supported amongst school pupils. And then we found that there was evidence to suggest that young people are quite skeptical about whether acts of political violence can ever be justified. So in the Association for Citizenship Teachers research, the questionnaires we gave to students included some questions to explore whether they felt like political violence could be justified for a variety of causes, such as religion, animal rights, and the like. And younger respondents, so the students in our study, tended to be less likely to suggest any justification for terrorism could be legitimate when compared to the general population. So we used a questionnaire that had been used for a wide range of audiences, and students were less likely to say that terrorism could be justified than the general population. So given those two observations, you might kind of reasonably conclude that there's no particular reason to believe that all young people need a specific FBV intervention. On the face of it, they're almost unanimously supportive of the concepts described as FBVs, and students are less likely to support violence than the general population. So you might criticise this aspect of the policy for being unnecessary, but perhaps no more than that. But qualitative data from other studies, so Green 2017, for instance, has indicated that some students experience this kind of specific framing of democracy, rule of law, tolerance as being fundamentally British in kind of really problematic ways, actually. And this raises the possibility that rather than being just redundant, there might be unintended but negative effects. And I think one of the key things to kind of always bear in mind is that actually for some students, and in this case, obviously specifically for Muslim students, they're more likely because of Prevent to feel stigmatized. So Lockley-Scott's research 2016 noted that Muslim students don't always feel that school is a safe place. So this quote from a student, don't always feel that school is a safe place, as ignorant people will associate with ISIS. My headscarf makes society view me as a terrorist. I think people are intimidated because they wear a headscarf. And several of the female respondents in Lockley-Scott's research reported that they felt they were being closely observed and treated in a bad way. And we found, or rather other researchers found, teachers have similar concerns. So Joel Busher and colleagues' work from 2017 found that over half of their survey respondents of teachers said that the Prevent duty had made Muslim students more likely to feel stigmatized. And then Farid Panjwani has collected data from Muslim teachers and found that while his respondents were largely happy to endorse those values in the FPV policy, they still experience conflict between the proclaimed values and the way in which they're used in the context to prevent. And many respondents to his work felt that the policy failed to address the ways in which Muslims were becoming a suspect community. So what can teachers do if teachers want to teach about these, these controversial, these sensitive issues? What is the approach against that kind of backdrop of what students want, but also what some of the problems are? And this is the kind of key thing for me, but also for a number of colleagues, and this is something that Farid Panjwani has written about, is to adopt an educational response over a safeguarding or a securitization one. And the teachers that I've spoken to and from multiple research projects tend to back this up. So this is a quote from a teacher: I think education is more effective than actually reporting people when it's too late and trying to re-educate them. Let's deal with it in the classroom situation rather than siphoning people off through the channel process, which is the channel process is where is there a sort of referral process if people are referred for potentially being radicalized or engaging activity that might be classed as extremism. They go through this process, the channel process. I mean, one thing I think to really kind of bear in mind is that the majority of teachers in research, so certainly those in all of my research, tend to be specialists. They tend to be citizenship teachers or RE or English teachers, where they have a kind of special responsibility for this, but a special kind of subject area knowledge that might or should support them. So I don't think it's surprising that there is this kind of desire for an educational response from that type of teacher. I think what would be interesting, and what I don't believe, I've not read any research, I don't believe there's a huge amount of research around non-specialist teachers who we know are being asked to teach this kind of stuff in form lessons, in PSHE lessons, but non-specialist teachers, a PE teacher who might be having to teach about radicalization, would they feel as comfortable going down this educational response over the kind of safeguarding one? And I think that's a potentially really interesting area that research perhaps hasn't yet kind of explored. So under that sort of framework, if we go down this route of thinking about educational responses, what are the kind of possible ways of doing that? Now, one of the key areas is this idea of critical literacy skills that might enable students to analyze text in a range of forms and styles. So, policy text, but also, probably more importantly, kind of media, traditional media, but I guess for students, social media. How can they analyze these and make sense of this kind of text in order to understand the ways that attitudes, beliefs, and actions are shaped? And actually, kind of critical literacy skills might be a way for students to develop a sort of stronger political or media literacies, and actually to enhance the democratic functions of schooling. And finding from the work with teachers that I just carried out since 9/11 suggested that actually teachers believe that these sort of skills should be embedded across the curriculum. They shouldn't just be in single subjects, just in English, just in citizenship, for instance, but they should be kind of embedded across the curriculum. And there should be some flexibility for teachers to sort of tailor that curriculum to local needs. And increased knowledge and understanding of the specific issue of terrorism and extremism. Also, it can operate as a way of building young people's more general understanding of democracy and the skills they can exhibit in finding, interrogating, and interpreting sources of information, which are also really fundamental skills for practicing democracy. So the second study in this sort of list, Davies 2008, talked about combining political and media literacy as essential components of anti-extremist education, and that teachers and students need to adopt an understanding of ambiguity, a sense that knowledge is provisional and always open to revision, and that being a kind of really important way to address these in the classroom. No, it's interesting. I find this couple of stats. So the Taylor et al. is a study I was involved in. It's the study, this since 9/11 study, published by UCL, and then Busher et al. is work by Joel Busher. But interesting here, these two, the similarity in the percentages here. But the teachers in both of these studies, essentially saying they have kind of really high levels of confidence teaching about these issues. So teaching about the fundamental British values, teaching about prevent or implementing the prevent policy. So teachers in the research do seem to suggest they're confident, they have a confidence in terms of this. I think it's always, again, really important to go back to this in both studies and across the research. These are generally specialist teachers, so it's maybe not hugely surprising that they feel confident. And that, again, might be an area where maybe there's less confidence among a sort of non-specialist teacher audience. I think there's a balance, and certainly, again, this is drawn from the literature, but also from my research since 9/11. There seems to be a balance between what teachers want to do and what they're able to do. So there's a tension evident across the research around this, and I think this is certainly, in terms of the literature, most pronounced in terms of what RE, citizenship, and English teachers want to do pedagogically, and then what's actually possible within a national policy context and within whole school and departmental contexts. What you have to do in terms of prevent, in terms of the safeguarding responsibilities. So in those subjects, particularly where discussion is the currency of the classroom, and where controversial issues can be the object of study, teachers did actually often express frustration in terms of their practice, in terms of what they were able to do and how far they were able to go. And there might be a sense, certainly this kind of range of literature, that in some areas, in some instances, the curriculum and delivery might be somewhat superficial and unprobing. Sort of to counter that, and the opposite side, is that for many teachers, though, they did feel like they could open up spaces and give room for debate in their classrooms. So a teacher from our work for the Association of Citizenship Teaching saying that actually the best thing that staff have done here is engaging with it and trying to discuss it with students, rather than sweeping it under the table and saying it's something you have to do when something comes up. And I mean, a very similar sentiment across a lot of the teachers we spoke to in the recent study as well. And in order to engage students in constructive discussion about controversial and sensitive issues, teachers need to use pedagogies that facilitate respectful disagreement and discussion, and that ask difficult questions in order to kind of understand the motivation for terrorist acts and extremist movements. So not just to condemn them, not to treat them as, in Diana Hess's kind of language, as kind of closed areas for discussion, but instead to kind of open them up and to talk about them and to teach them in ways that are more open and that allow for that kind of level of discussion. And such forms of pedagogy, I think, are underpinned by those critical literacy practices, which analyse the assumptions, power relations, and calls to action within different texts. I think the flip side to that is that you also need to be respectful and mindful of what others, of the safe space that you try to create in your classroom. And if you're opening up discussion that might be problematic, and that some students might, say things that are that aren't tolerant and that are, offensive, for instance, is that a problem in terms of what's happening with the other students in the classroom? Are you potentially causing offence to those other students? And trying to get that balance right and that trade-off right, I think, is a real area kind of tension and difficulty actually for teachers. I think the next slide. Yeah, so other teachers talked about challenging intolerance or extremist views as being one of the benefits to opening up debates for discussion, opening up space for discussion. So you've got a teacher here quoted in our recent study. So when they have views that they've heard from their parents or from others, or they've seen on the internet, when they have that challenged, it can feel like a bit of a shock to them. They see themselves in a way that's a bit uncomfortable, but it's important to put them in that position so they get to see how other people see them. So having discussions can bring about, although it might bring about the possibility of offensive views or extremist views being raised, that then gives the opportunity for teachers and potentially for peers to challenge those views. So there's definitely kind of benefits to it. But like I say, it also runs the risk of making the classroom an unsafe space for others. So you end up with this kind of tension between allowing for the free and candid expression of views, respect, safety of others, versus the problems that you might be creating. And that's something that actually, in wider society, in relation to online spaces, for instance, is a kind of debate that's going on anyway, more broadly than schools and education at the moment. Callan in 2011 wrote about, in terms of American universities, argued that allowing more intellectual candor and honest talking provides a greater opportunity to change opinions and to challenge those hateful views. Whereas if you enforce stronger rules on speech, it can lead to students not sharing their real opinions. And noted in that managing those discussions requires really skillful teaching, but obviously can have that positive outcome. And if you close down those spaces for debate, do you end up just pushing those views to the margin, and actually students don't ever have them challenged and don't ever have the chance to kind of rethink them. But in terms of sort of actual specific or more specific teaching practices, and again, going back to my work with Lee, several teachers pointed out in their interviews that because they'd grown up kind of post 9/11, and obviously they weren't alive at the time of 9/11, but have grown up obviously in the period following it. For them, a lot of them, terrorism is often associated with Islam. And so talks about using additional case studies, different case studies, as a strategy to try and overcome that default connection. And several teachers or several schools, so teachers in several schools often identified independently these same three examples in this quotation. So you've got Islamic State as the sort of obviously an organization that features in relatively contemporary politics, certainly it did a few years ago. The IRA as a sort of violent political organization within the UK's recent-ish history, and then the actions of the ANC in South Africa as a sort of a theoretically understandable response to apartheid. The problem with this, although there are clear benefits in terms of bringing in different experiences and different forms of terrorism that you can then have discussions around, the problem is the danger of treating history as parable. So particularly in time-poor situations where teachers perhaps end up having to shortcut to the messages that you want to derive from considering them, you can end up taking each example as a kind of moral lesson. And whatever you feel about these moral lessons, it's noteworthy that this method of extracting simple moral judgments sits uneasily with the general approach to teaching controversial issues, where you would hope to go into more depth. And each of these three examples is obviously incredibly complex. And if you just take this very superficial, this is just the message that I'm trying to get across from it, you end up in a sort of problematic situation. So then in terms of kind of resources, so moving on a little bit, and in terms of resources for teaching about Prevent and the FBVs, the Educate Against Hate website is set up and run by the DFE, and it collects together a kind of a really wide range. There are a lot of resources on there, and it's probably one of the better known repositories for teachers in terms of finding resources. And it also has sections aimed at parents and school leaders, but I think the teacher section is the most interesting. But the website and its resources on it are problematic. So we know that students want to build their understanding of terrorism and extremism so they can develop a better understanding of what's happening around them. But the materials on offer to teachers to help them address this, and I'm sure a whole range of teachers use it, but this, again, if we think specifically about non-specialist teachers who might be coming to this kind of website looking for resources, the materials, I think the demand largely falls short of that ambition. And there's problems in a number of ways. So some of the resources present distorted or simplified narratives or portrayals of suspect groups, which might risk exasperating prejudice. And if we think about the case studies, from a previous slide, that's a kind of classic example where you could easily imagine a resource that was based on those that was incredibly simplified and actually, problematic because of that. Some of the resources, a lot of the resources, fail to acknowledge children's own developing opinions and agency, and then end up talking down to young people in quite patronizing tones, or a lot end up playing up the security role of teachers. One of them, or one of the kind of links that's presented in the same way of resources is literally, how do I go about reporting something? And it links you to the process through the police or the channel process. And it's, I think that kind of thing potentially risks undermining the distinctive educational relationships that distinguish schools from other state-funded institutions. And, clearly this section of the website is aimed at teachers. There's a school level, there's a school leaders section. So it's all, that is their audience, but some of it is problematic in some ways. But there were some examples of good resources. I think it's very easy to just sort of write it off completely. There were some good resources, and I think, and we've kind of talked, working with Lee and a colleague Hans from UCL, we've thought about what might be some of the things in those positive resources that you could look at. And, if you're a non-specialist teacher, for instance, in particular, how might you kind of try and judge those resources, and what might be some of the things that you look for? So teaching and school guidance should address how to balance children's right to security with their other rights, so to information, to develop informed opinions, to express themselves. Otherwise, you end up with security concerns potentially leading children's rights and education to be marginalised. Resources should include a kind of better representation of minority groups and include diverse examples drawn from across countering violent extremist policy. And ideally, resources should offer students the opportunity to learn about different people's experiences and avoid the narrow stereotypes, which some resources very much went down the line of. There are kind of political debates around the extent to which countering violent extremist policies unfairly focus on minority groups. And obviously I mentioned Muslims and Islamophobia in an earlier slide, which have obviously been the main focus of Prevent work, but actually latterly white working class communities can be associated with the far right as well. So it's not just confined to that single group. So it will be wise to kind of encourage teachers through the resources to engage with these debates so that students can kind of connect learning with the discussions occurring in the media and in their local communities. The voices of young people, we kind of believe should be incorporated, particularly in the creation of both policy and resources which interpret it. And then resources need to really clearly articulate the learning intentions to ensure that the educational purpose is clear. Otherwise, you risk resources appearing to adopt a security perspective again with no obvious educational benefit. So that kind of sums up, I guess, the Educate Against Hate website and the resource side. I think that's my last. Oh, there's one more. Oh yeah. So just to kind of briefly summarize and the sort of top level things. Students kind of say that they want to learn about these issues. So, and I think we're in a position where students are the students in our survey or in our research were generally quite clear actually in terms of wanting to learn about these issues. That was a pretty clear finding. There wasn't too much kind of shade in terms of that. Specialist teachers seem to express confidence in teaching about them, so that's a real positive. But like I say, I've kind of mentioned it a couple of times, but I think there is a bit of a blind spot in the research in terms of work with non-specialists. And I think that's something that we just don't know really at the moment in terms of the levels of confidence there. And obviously also, we do know that schools do adopt a safeguarding approach in terms of Prevent. That is definitely something that, they have reporting mechanisms. So while research with citizenship teachers might present a positive outlook in some schools, and that definitely, there are some schools doing some great work, I would be interested to know what was happening, across the whole sector, and whether the safeguarding approach, if you didn't focus on citizenship teachers, for instance, whether the safeguarding approach and the securitization approach came out a bit more strongly. But for the teachers we spoke to, who obviously were from those backgrounds, opening up spaces and giving room for debate was really important. but obviously balanced against that, you need to handle that carefully. Safe spaces need to be safe and inclusive. So there's a kind of tension with that. And then there are definitely examples of good resources to support. So both the Association for Citizenship Teachers and Since 9/11 have both published resources which are, which I think do a good job. Although I'm obviously have been in the pay of both in various ways. So, but then the sort of repository of Educate Against Hate contains a lot of problematic stuff as well. But if teachers know what to look for and can kind of be guided, then there is some good stuff out there. And I think that's probably me. I think that's the end of the presentation. I think I've just got some references. Yeah, some incredibly tiny references in terms of size, and that's that. Thanks a lot.